She was born in a one-room cottage so poor it barely kept the cold out. She died in exile, drowning in debt, forgotten by the world she once ruled. But in between, she became the most desired woman in Europe. Kings listened when she spoke. Queens trusted her secrets. Artists immortalized her body. And Britain's greatest war hero lost his heart to her, and nearly his honor. She had no title, no money, no protection, only beauty, instinct, and a terrifying ability to read people before they spoke. This is not a love story. It's a rise powered by desire, and a fall paid for with reputation, loyalty, and blood. Her name was Emma Hamilton, and the world adored her, right up until it destroyed her. She was born into silence, not the sacred kind, not the peaceful kind, but the silence that follows poverty, the kind that settles after words have already failed. Swan Cottage stood alone at the edge of marshland in Cheshire, its walls warped by damp wind, its roof patched more times than anyone could remember. It was a house that survived rather than lived. On an April morning in 1765, as mist hovered low over the fields and the distant cry of gulls drifted inland from the River Dee, Amy Lyon entered the world wrapped in coarse cloth that smelled of wood smoke and iron. Her mother's hands were cracked and swollen from labor. Her father's blacksmith apron lay folded nearby, stiff with soot and ash. Henry Lyon was still alive when his daughter first cried. He stood at the foot of the bed, broad shoulders slumped, hands hanging uselessly at his sides. He did not smile. He did not speak. He only nodded once, not in joy, but in recognition, as if he already understood the shape of the life that waited for this child. Within weeks, Henry Lyon was dead. The forge fire that had fed him also took him. Illness came quickly, without drama, without mercy. One day the hammer rang against iron. The next, the house was quiet in a way that frightened widows and marked children for life. Amy would never remember her father's voice, but she would remember absence. Her mother stood alone in the doorway of Swan Cottage with an infant in her arms and no future that did not involve work. There was no inheritance, no savings, no protection, only labor, endless, grinding labor that bent the spine and hollowed the eyes. She washed clothes for neighbors until her fingers bled. She scrubbed floors that would never truly come clean. She stitched garments by candlelight long after her body begged for rest. The cottage absorbed every sound, the slap of wet linen, the scrape of pots, the sighs she thought she kept hidden. Amy grew up listening. Before she learned letters, she learned people. She noticed how adults spoke differently to those who mattered. She learned the tone of command and the tone of pleading. She sensed tension before it surfaced, danger before it announced itself, even as a small child. She understood something fundamental. Survival depended not on strength, but on awareness. The village spoke kindly of her mother. Quiet woman, hard worker, tragic circumstances. They spoke more freely of the child. "She's a pretty one," they said casually, as though noting the weather. Amy heard these words without understanding their weight. Beauty, at Swan Cottage, was not a gift. It did not buy bread. It did not keep out the cold. But it shaped how people looked at her, longer than necessary. With curiosity rather than cruelty, at night, when the fire burned low. Her mother told stories, not fairy tales, stories of endurance, of women who survived husbands lost at sea, of daughters sent away too young, of lives bent but not broken. Amy listened without interrupting. She did not cry easily. She did not ask why. She learned early that questions did not change outcomes. By the time she was old enough to be useful, Childhood had already slipped away. She gathered kindling, washed pots, learned to stitch cloth so coarse it scraped her fingers raw. Each task was small. But together, they formed the shape of a life already decided for her. Travelers passed through Cheshire occasionally, bringing fragments of another world. London, theaters, music, rooms warmed by candlelight instead of damp hearths, portraits hung in gold frames. Amy listened. She imagined without daring to hope. Her mother watched her closely, not with ambition, but with fear. Fear that the girl's face would draw attention they could not afford. Fear that Swan Cottage would not be able to hold her forever. Fear that poverty, like gravity, would pull her down no matter how carefully she walked. When Amy reached the age where hands were expected to earn their keep, the decision came quietly. There was no argument, no dramatic farewell, only necessity. One cool morning, mist clung to the lane as Amy stepped away from Swan Cottage with a small bundle tied in string. Her mother stood in the doorway, her face composed with the discipline of someone who could not afford to break. The door creaked as the wind nudged it. That sound, old wood shifting in its frame, followed Amy down the lane. She did not look back twice. She had already learned that longing slowed you down. Service was not cruel in the way stories sometimes suggest. It was worse. It was indifferent. Amy cleaned rooms for people who rarely noticed her existence. She fetched water, carried messages, learned to move silently through hallways. She memorized the rhythms of households, the moods of employers, the invisible lines that separated those who spoke from those who listened. She was small, efficient, unfailingly polite, and always watching. She noticed how women adjusted their posture when men entered rooms, how men softened their voices when they wished to persuade, how servants learned invisibility as a skill. Poverty followed her from house to house. Wages were meager, positions temporary, stability elusive. Hunger came quietly, not as a crisis, but as a dull ache that sharpened awareness. Amy learned how to conserve energy, how to move without waste, how to work without complaint. Her body adapted before her mind could question why. She grew taller, thinner. Her face changed. People noticed. Not openly, not yet, but eyes lingered. Conversations paused when she entered rooms. Compliments were offered casually, then withdrawn, as if acknowledging beauty in someone so lowly felt improper. Amy noticed everything. She did not react. Reaction invited attention. Attention was dangerous. By her mid-teens, Amy had traveled farther than most girls from Swan Cottage ever would. And yet she owned nothing. No money, no protection, no future promised. London drew closer with every change of employment, not as a dream, but as an inevitability. When she finally arrived, the city did not welcome her. It overwhelmed her. London smelled of coal smoke and wet stone. The streets pressed inward, loud with wheels, voices, shouting vendors. Buildings towered in ways that made the sky feel distant and irrelevant. Amy stood still at the edge of a crowded street, clutching her bundle. No one noticed. London did not pause for the frightened. That was when she understood something with brutal clarity. If she was to survive, she would have to become more than invisible. She would have to become deliberate, and somewhere, deep beneath fear and hunger. That realization took root. Life would not remain small, and it would not be gentle. London did not care where you came from. It only cared whether you could keep up. Amy learned this within days. The city moved like a living thing, impatient, crowded, forever hungry. Streets twisted into one another without logic. Smoke pressed low against the sky, turning daylight dull and gray. Everywhere, people were in motion, not toward happiness, but away from ruin. She followed them. Her first lodging was a narrow room shared with 4 other girls, servants, seamstresses, laborers' daughters, all of them temporary, all of them replaceable. The air was thick with sweat and damp wool. Privacy did not exist. At night, bodies shifted inches apart, breath overlapping, dreams colliding in restless sleep. Amy did not sleep deeply. She listened. London never truly went quiet. Footsteps echoed at all hours. Shouts rose and vanished. Somewhere nearby, laughter sharpened by drink cut through the dark. Somewhere else. A woman cried behind a door that stayed closed. Amy learned the city's sounds the way others learned maps. Which noises meant danger, which meant nothing at all, which meant opportunity. Work came quickly and vanished just as fast. She scrubbed floors until her hands split and burned. She carried buckets of water up staircases so narrow they bruised her shoulders. She cleaned chambers she would never sleep in, laid fires she would never warm herself beside. Employers changed faces, but not expectations. Some were brisk and efficient, others cruel in ways that did not leave marks. A word spoken too loudly, a hand lingering too long, a look that measured her not for her labor, but for her body. Amy noticed. She always noticed, but she did not react. Reaction invited attention. Attention invited consequence. She learned instead to control her presence. Her gaze softened. Her posture adjusted. Her movements became economical, deliberate. She spoke only when spoken to. But when she did, her voice was calm, agreeable, unthreatening. This was not submission. It was strategy. London did not reward innocence. It rewarded adaptation. Her beauty, once incidental, became impossible to ignore. It was not refined, not yet, but it was striking. Her face held emotion easily, shifting without effort. Her eyes seemed to listen even when her mouth remained still. People felt seen by her without knowing why. Men noticed first. Their attention was rarely kind. Often it was transactional. Compliments delivered like claims. Invitations disguised as generosity. Promises that carried expectations they did not bother to hide. Amy learned to deflect without confrontation. She stepped aside before situations turned. She exited rooms gracefully. She understood when to smile and when to disappear. Safety lay in anticipation. She watched women who survived better than others, those who dressed carefully even when poor, those who understood that dignity could be performed, those who knew when to refuse and how to refuse without provoking retaliation. Amy practiced quietly, in reflections caught in window glass, in polished metal, in water basins. She studied herself, adjusted posture, experimented with expression. She learned how small changes altered how she was perceived. The knowledge unsettled her, because it worked. Invisibility, perfected, became control, still. London offered no stability. Positions ended abruptly. Money vanished quickly. Illness spread easily in rooms packed too tightly with bodies. There were weeks when hunger returned, not as a shock, but as a reminder. Amy endured. Endurance did not guarantee reward, but it kept you alive long enough for opportunity to notice you. Opportunity arrived wearing spectacle. Dr. James Graham's Temple of Health was whispered about long before Amy saw it. Electricity, perfumes, music, promises of renewal. People spoke of it with fascination and ridicule in equal measure. When Amy entered that world, it felt unreal. Light shimmered, sound echoed, bodies were displayed with theatrical intention. Graham understood something fundamental about people. They wanted to believe transformation was possible, if only they stood close enough to it. Amy watched him work. She watched the crowd. She saw how posture commanded attention, how silence, timed correctly, spoke louder than words, how suggestion shaped perception, how desire could be guided without being named. Her role was small. Her education was not. She learned what it meant to be looked at, not as a servant, but as a focal point. It frightened her, and it awakened something she did not yet have a name for. When her association with Graham ended, she carried the lessons with her. Presence was power. Beauty was leverage, and both could be shaped. London sharpened her awareness further. She no longer thought only in terms of work and shelter. She thought in terms of trajectory. Where she stood mattered less than where she might be positioned next. It was during this period that Charles Greville noticed her. He did not approach dramatically. He observed. Greville saw not only her face, but her malleability, her intelligence, her instinctive responsiveness to instruction, where others saw ornament. He saw potential. Their conversations were measured, polite, purposeful. He spoke of improvement, education, refinement, stability. Amy listened. She had learned long ago not to confuse kindness with opportunity. Greville did not offer affection. He offered direction. He offered her a new name, Emma Hart. The name felt unfamiliar, like a garment she had not yet learned to wear, but she accepted it because London had taught her one unforgiving truth. Those who refuse the next step are trampled by it. As Amy Lyon stepped into Greville's world, she understood that anonymity was finished. Whatever came next would require something from her, and London, having taken what it wished, finally loosened its grip. Charles Greville did not fall in love with Amy Lyon. He evaluated her. That distinction mattered. He noticed her the way collectors notice rare objects, not with hunger, but with calculation. He watched how she stood at the edge of the rooms, how her gaze lingered just long enough to suggest attention, how she spoke little but absorbed everything. He saw not innocence, but potential, not passion, but pliability. Greville was a man trained to recognize value before others named it, and Amy Lyon, standing half-lit in a London interior heavy with smoke and ambition, registered immediately as something unfinished and therefore useful. When he first spoke to her, his tone was mild, educated, unhurried. He did not compliment her beauty outright. He spoke instead of circumstance, of wasted ability, of how the world rewarded those who understood its rules. Amy listened. She had learned that men who spoke softly often carried sharper intentions. Greville asked questions that did not feel invasive, but were, where she had worked, what she could read, whether she could sing, whether she understood art, posture, restraint. His interest was not personal. It was architectural. He was not asking who she was. He was assessing what she could become. What he offered her did not arrive dressed as rescue. It arrived as instruction. A room that was warmer than anything she had known. Clothing chosen carefully, not extravagantly. Books placed within reach. Lessons given casually, as though improvement were a natural expectation rather than a demand. Greville never raised his voice. He never needed to. Control did not come from force. It came from framing options until only one remained reasonable. Amy learned quickly that gratitude was assumed. She learned to sit properly, to speak with moderation, to move her hands with intention. He corrected her gently, often without words. A look, a pause, a slight adjustment made himself. Fingers precise, impersonal. She understood what was being built. She did not resist, because resistance would have returned her to the streets. Greville introduced her to a new name, Emma Hart. It sounded softer, more malleable, less burdened by origin. Amy accepted it without ceremony. Names, she had learned, were tools, under Greville's guidance. Her beauty was refined into presentation. He dressed her to suggest taste rather than excess. He taught her when to speak, and, more importantly, when not to. He explained society not as a moral structure, but as a system of incentives. Men valued novelty. Women valued status. Everyone valued advantage. Emotion, he implied, was optional. Emma absorbed these lessons with frightening efficiency. She learned how to hold a room without demanding it, how to listen in ways that made others reveal themselves, how to mirror tone and posture until comfort replaced suspicion. Greville watched her transformation with satisfaction. Not pride, ownership. He did not sleep with her immediately. That, too, was a calculation. Delay created dependency. Distance preserved authority. Desire, unfulfilled, remained useful. When intimacy finally occurred, it was unceremonious, quiet, controlled. Greville did not pretend it was love. He treated it as a logical extension of arrangement. Emma did not protest. She had already understood the exchange: shelter for compliance, instruction for loyalty, security for silence. Yet something within her recoiled, not from the act itself, but from the emptiness that followed. Greville did not linger. He did not soften. He did not pretend the moment carried meaning beyond convenience. Emma lay awake afterward, staring at the ceiling, aware of a subtle shift. She was no longer merely being shaped, she was being managed. Greville's world widened around her. She attended gatherings, observed conversations, learned which names carried weight and which merely occupied space. She learned to smile without inviting familiarity, to charm without surrendering authority. Men noticed her. Greville noticed that they noticed, and that was when his affection cooled. Not because he feared losing her, but because she was becoming expensive. Greville's finances were precarious. He lived carefully, reliant on support from his uncle, Sir William Hamilton, a diplomat of stature, a collector of antiquities, a man whose position insulated him from the risks Greville now faced. Emma sensed the change before it was explained. Greville grew distracted. His gaze lingered elsewhere. Conversations shortened. The structure he had built around her felt suddenly provisional. One evening, she noticed a letter on his desk, sealed, addressed in his hand. She did not read it. She did not need to. The air in the room told her everything. Greville had reached a conclusion. When he spoke of Naples, he did so gently. He described warmth, culture, opportunity, Sir William's generosity. He framed the decision as benevolence. Emma listened in silence. She understood what was happening. She was being transferred, not discarded, repositioned. Greville did not ask whether she wished to go. He explained why she must. Resistance would have been emotional. Emotion was not a language Greville respected. Emma prepared quietly. She packed what she had been given. She thanked him when thanked was expected. She did not accuse. She did not plead. She had learned too much to mistake calculation for betrayal. On the day of departure, Greville escorted her only as far as the carriage. His farewell was polite, measured, almost relieved. He did not look back. Emma did, not because she loved him, but because she understood that the version of herself he had created would now belong to someone else. As the carriage rolled away, she felt no triumph, only clarity. She had learned how power operated, and she knew now, with certainty, that being shaped came at a cost, one she had not yet finished paying. The sea changed everything. After weeks of gray water and creaking wood, Naples appeared like a contradiction. Light spilled across the harbor in colors Emma had never seen before, blues too deep to be named. Whites warmed by sun instead of soot. The air carried salt, citrus, smoke from hillside kitchens. Voices rose and fell with musical insistence, for the first time since leaving England. Emma breathed without effort. She stood at the rail as the ship slowed, skirts tugged by wind, hair loose from its pins. She felt the city before she saw it clearly, a warmth that reached her skin and did not ask permission. Naples did not press inward like London. It opened. Sir William Hamilton did not rush to her. He observed, from the quay. He watched the young woman Greville had sent him, not with hunger, not with ownership, with the careful attention of a man accustomed to art. He had spent decades studying fragments of antiquity, learning that meaning revealed itself slowly, through posture, through restraint. Emma felt his gaze before he spoke, when he approached. His manner was gentle, unhurried. He greeted her with courtesy, not curiosity. His voice carried years of diplomacy, calm, precise, free of demand. "You must be tired," he said. It was not a question. It was the first kindness she did not need to earn. The carriage ride through Naples overwhelmed her. Color replaced soot. Sound replaced clatter. The city moved with an expressive rhythm. Merchants shouting, children laughing, women gesturing broadly as they spoke. Emotion here was not hidden. It was performed openly, unapologetically. Sir William's villa stood above the bay, looking outward rather than inward. Light flooded its rooms. Air moved freely. Art lined the walls. Statues, vases, fragments of a past preserved by admiration rather than possession. Emma walked slowly. She had learned that rushing betrayed ignorance. Sir William did not instruct her immediately. That, too, was a lesson. He allowed her to observe, to settle, to acclimate to a world that did not require her to shrink. He spoke to her during meals, asking not what she knew, but what she noticed. He listened to her answers without correcting them. For the first time, Emma felt that her perceptions were not being extracted, they were being invited. Naples reshaped her days. Mornings opened with light instead of smoke. Afternoons stretched with conversation, music, study. Evenings brought gatherings, scholars, musicians, visiting dignitaries. Emma moved among them quietly at first, absorbing cadence, gesture, mood. Sir William watched. He saw how she adapted without instruction, how she mirrored tone without mimicry, how she listened in a way that made others feel central. He recognized a rare quality, not beauty alone, but presence sharpened by intelligence. He encouraged her gently, introduced her to artists, placed her among sculptures, asked her to hold poses, not stiffly, but intuitively. Emma discovered something astonishing. She could become still without disappearing. She learned how the body could speak without words, how sorrow could be suggested by tilt alone, how dignity emerged from restraint. She did not imitate statues. She inhabited them. Artists began to notice. They asked her to sit, to pose, to embody figures drawn from myth and history. Draped simply, she transformed. Grief, serenity, longing passing across her face like controlled weather. These sessions were not exploitation. They were revelation. For the first time, Emma saw herself reflected not as a servant, not as a possession, but as a subject worthy of attention. Sir William encouraged this transformation with care. He did not push her into display. He allowed her to choose when and how she appeared. He spoke to her of antiquity, of how civilizations expressed power not through force, but through beauty, symbolism, influence. Soft power, he called it, though not yet by name. Emma understood instinctively. She learned that admiration could open doors violence never could. That influence, properly wielded, required patience and empathy rather than command. Naples rewarded her openness. She learned the language quickly. She laughed more easily. She moved with confidence born not of arrogance, but belonging. Her past did not vanish, but it loosened its grip. When Sir William proposed marriage, it was not dramatic, it was considered. He spoke of partnership, of companionship, of mutual respect. He did not promise passion, he promised stability. Emma accepted, not out of desperation, but out of clarity. As Lady Hamilton, she stepped fully into a world of diplomacy and art. She hosted gatherings with grace. She mediated conversations with intuition. She charmed not through performance alone, but through genuine attention. The Neapolitan court took notice. Queen Maria Carolina, sharp-eyed and anxious, recognized Emma's value immediately. Not as decoration, but as a conduit. Emma listened to the Queen's fears, offered calm where panic threatened to unravel judgment. Emma did not seek power, but power settled around her. She stood at the intersection of art, diplomacy, and emotion, a place few occupied with ease. Her performances, her attitudes, became legendary, draped in simple cloth. She embodied mythic figures with startling immediacy. Audiences fell silent. Time seemed to pause. Emma did not act. She revealed. Sir William watched with pride. He had not created her. He had recognized her. Naples became home for the first time. Emma felt neither hidden nor hunted. She belonged to rooms that mattered. She influenced conversations that shaped alliances. Her past felt distant, almost unreal, and yet, history does not pause for comfort. Rumors of revolution reached Naples. France trembled. Monarchies whispered. Fear spread quietly through palaces that had long believed themselves immune. Sir William grew thoughtful. Emma grew attentive. Neither knew that a man marked by war was already moving toward their lives, a man whose arrival would fracture the careful balance Emma had built. But for now, the bay shimmered beneath moonlight, and Emma Hamilton stood at its edge. Reborn. War arrived in Naples before Horatio Nelson did. It came as rumors first. Whispers carried across drawing rooms. Murmured anxieties folded into diplomatic conversations. France was no longer merely restless. It was burning. Kings fell. Blood rewrote order. Europe held its breath. Emma felt the shift before she understood it. Voices lowered. Laughter grew brittle. The Queen's eyes darkened with memories she could not escape. A sister executed. A crown torn from history by rage disguised as justice. Sir William spoke less freely now. Maps appeared on tables where music had once rested. Letters arrived sealed in wax, their contents heavy with implication. And then, one afternoon, a name began to circulate with unusual gravity. Horatio Nelson. Emma heard it spoken first with caution, then with reverence. A British naval officer. Brilliant, uncompromising, already marked by battle. A man whose loyalty to his country bordered on obsession. She imagined him incorrectly. She imagined a monument, polished, unyielding, remote. The man who arrived was something else entirely. Nelson entered Naples quietly. Without ceremony, his ship anchored in the bay beneath a sky too blue to acknowledge the violence he carried with him. When he stepped onto land, he did so with visible effort. His body bore the cost of duty, one eye clouded by injury, scars etched into his face with indifferent precision. He moved with the discipline of someone accustomed to pain, not avoiding it, not indulging it, simply accounting for it. Emma first saw him as Lady Hamilton, standing beside Sir William in her role as hostess. She watched him carefully. He did not carry himself like a man accustomed to admiration. He carried himself like a man accustomed to expectation. Every movement deliberate, every word measured. His voice was calm, but beneath it ran something taut, a tension that never fully released. When they were introduced, he bowed slightly, awkwardly, as though unused to stillness. His gaze met hers without calculation, and then something unexpected happened. He looked relieved, not because of her beauty, though that registered, but because she did not look at him as a symbol. She looked at him as a man who had traveled far and carried too much. Their first conversation was brief, polite, proper. But Emma noticed what others missed, the way his shoulders lowered when she asked about his journey rather than his victories, the way his voice softened when he spoke of his men rather than himself, the way his gaze sharpened when politics entered the conversation, as though he were bracing for disappointment. Nelson noticed her too, not as an ornament, not as performance, but as attention without demand. He did not stay long that first evening. Duty pulled him away. Meetings waited, decisions pressed, but the impression lingered. Naples changed around him. The city that had felt warm and open now felt precarious. The court grew tense. Fear moved quietly through marble halls. Queen Maria Carolina relied increasingly on Emma's presence. Confiding anxieties she dared not voice publicly. Emma listened. She always listened. Nelson returned often, sometimes to consult Sir William, sometimes simply to sit, to rest, to speak without being evaluated. Emma noticed the cost of command etched into him more deeply with each visit, the fatigue he refused to name, the moments when his remaining hand trembled slightly before steadying, the weight of expectation that pressed upon him even in repose. She offered no solutions. She offered space. They spoke of art, of antiquity, of the sea not as battlefield, but as presence, vast, indifferent, enduring. Nelson spoke cautiously at first, then with increasing honesty. He spoke of responsibility as though it were a debt that could never be repaid, of men lost under his command, of decisions that haunted him long after applause faded. Emma listened without interruption. She did not flinch at his injuries. She did not romanticize his suffering. She acknowledged it, and in that acknowledgement, something shifted. Nelson found himself returning not for counsel, but for calm. The Hamilton residence became a refuge, Sir William noticed. He said nothing, whether out of trust, fatigue, or understanding. He did not interfere. He welcomed Nelson as a friend, an ally, a man carrying burdens too heavy to be managed alone. Emma's role deepened. She became more than hostess, more than confidant. She became bridge between the Queen's terror, Sir William's diplomacy, and Nelson's uncompromising sense of duty. She understood each of them, and they sensed it. Naples teetered. French forces advanced. The monarchy trembled. Decisions carried consequences that could not be undone. Nelson faced pressure from every direction. Britain demanded action. Allies demanded reassurance. Enemies waited for weakness. In the evenings, when the villa grew quiet, Emma found Nelson standing at the window, staring out at the bay. He spoke little then. She stood beside him. Silence. She had learned. Could be a gift. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "I am tired," he said once, not as complaint, but confession. Emma did not respond immediately. Then she said, simply, "I know." No praise, no reassurance, no denial, just recognition. It undid him more than admiration ever could. Their closeness deepened gradually, almost imperceptibly. There were no declarations, no transgressions spoken aloud, only proximity. Glances held a moment too long, conversations that lingered after others departed, a hand offered when balance faltered, a shared understanding that neither of them named. Sir William saw it, and he did nothing. Perhaps he understood that Emma's presence gave Nelson strength the war demanded. Perhaps he recognized that love, in whatever form it took, did not diminish loyalty. It complicated it. Or perhaps he simply accepted that time reshaped all arrangements. The court began to whisper. Emma felt it, but she did not retreat. She had learned long ago that visibility was inevitable. Control was the only defense. Nelson's orders arrived abruptly. He was to prepare for action. The Mediterranean would not remain quiet. France would not pause. On the night before his departure, the three of them dined together in subdued silence. Candles burned low. Outside, the sea whispered against stone. Nelson rose first. Duty waited. Emma stood. Their eyes met. Nothing was said, but everything was understood. As he left the villa, Emma felt something tighten within her. Not fear, recognition. This was not a passing connection. This was collision between two lives shaped by survival, sharpened by endurance, bound by forces larger than desire. As the door closed behind him, its sound echoed softly through the corridor. Emma remained still. She knew now that her rebirth in Naples was not an ending. It was preparation. War had entered her life not as violence, but as inevitability, and Horatio Nelson carried it with him, in his body, in his silence, in the fate drawing steadily closer. Love did not arrive in a single moment. It arrived in increments, in glances held too long, in silences that felt deliberate rather than empty, in the way Horatio Nelson began to look for Emma Hamilton before he looked for anyone else in a room. Naples noticed before they did. The court had always been alert to shifts in gravity. Who stood beside whom? Who whispered after gatherings ended? Who lingered when etiquette suggested departure? Emma had learned this language well. She had spoken it fluently. Now she was written into it. At first, the whispers were faint, curiosity rather than condemnation, a fascination with proximity. The British hero, the ambassador's wife, the woman whose presence seemed to soften the sharpest men in Europe. Emma felt the change in air. She adjusted her posture, her speech, her appearances. She did not withdraw. Withdrawal invited speculation. She remained visible, controlled, composed, unassailable. Nelson, by contrast, struggled. He was a man accustomed to command, not scrutiny. On the sea, judgment arrived as cannon fire in Naples. It came as smiles held too long, as silences where applause once lived. His loyalty to Britain was absolute. His loyalty to Emma was becoming unavoidable. They did not speak of love. That would have been dangerous. Instead, they spoke of duty, of fear, of exhaustion. Nelson returned from meetings pale with strain. Orders shifted. Alliances frayed. The Mediterranean trembled beneath competing ambitions. Napoleon's shadow stretched farther each week. Emma listened, She always listened. She absorbed intelligence without appearing to collect it. She remembered details others dismissed. She understood not only what was said, but what could not be said. Queen Maria Carolina relied on her more openly now. The queen's fear was not abstract. She had seen what revolution did to royalty. She had lost her sister to the blade. Her kingdom felt suddenly fragile. Emma became her anchor. She sat beside her during long evenings, offered calm when panic threatened clarity, translated diplomatic language into emotional truth, and through Emma, messages flowed between queen and ambassador, between ambassador and admiral, between fear and action. Emma did not command. She connected. Nelson began to understand her power not as influence, but as coherence. She brought order to chaos by listening long enough to see its shape. That frightened him and bound him to her more tightly. Their intimacy crossed a threshold quietly. No announcement. No dramatic confession. One evening, after hours of tense discussion about French movements, Nelson remained behind. Sir William had retired. The house breathed softly around them. Emma poured wine. Their hands brushed. Neither withdrew. The moment stretched. Not electric, but inevitable. When Nelson finally spoke, his voice was low. "I cannot afford this," he said. Emma met his gaze. "Neither can I," she replied, and yet they did not step back. Love, when it arrived, was not gentle. It was a recognition between two people shaped by endurance rather than innocence. They did not idealize each other. They saw the damage clearly and accepted it. Nelson loved her because she did not demand less of him. Emma loved him because he did not reduce her to what she provided. The scandal followed swiftly. Naples whispered, then spoke, then speculated openly. The British press sharpened its knives from afar. A married man, a married woman. The line between patriotism and betrayal blurred with alarming speed. Emma understood the cost immediately. Her reputation had always been provisional. Nelson's was national. Sir William understood as well. He watched the storm gather without rage, whether from affection, resignation, or a diplomat's understanding that public order mattered more than private suffering. He chose silence. That silence was both shield and sentence. Emma carried guilt quietly. She did not apologize for loving Nelson, but she understood what she was dismantling. The queen, pragmatic and terrified, chose sides swiftly. She needed Nelson. She needed Britain. She needed Emma. Morality became secondary to survival. Emma's role expanded dangerously. She carried messages, interpreted intentions, softened ultimatums. She knew too much. Nelson depended on her more openly now, not only emotionally, strategically. He trusted her judgment. That trust frightened others. And when Naples finally collapsed under French pressure, when the royal family fled, when the city descended into chaos, Emma stood at the center of a hurricane she had not created, but could not escape. Love did not save her. It implicated her, as executions followed restorations, as vengeance disguised itself as justice. Emma's name became tangled with decisions that would stain history. Nelson defended her fiercely. Britain hesitated. The line between loyalty and excess blurred fatally. Emma watched herself become a symbol, not of beauty, not of art, but of controversy. And she understood something with devastating clarity. Soft power cuts both ways. It elevates and it destroys. As the storm reached its peak, as ships prepared to sail, as alliances fractured beyond repair. Emma stood once more beside the same sea that had once promised rebirth. Now it reflected something colder. Love had arrived, so had consequence, and neither could be undone. At the height of her power, Emma Hamilton did not look powerful. That was the secret. She did not command rooms with force or demand attention with spectacle. She did it the way gravity works, silently, inevitably. People leaned toward her without knowing why. Decisions bent subtly in her presence. Conversations changed shape once she entered them. Naples was no longer simply a city. It was a battlefield that had not yet admitted it. After the collapse of the Neapolitan Republic and the violent restoration of the monarchy, fear ruled more efficiently than law. Executions followed proclamations. Retribution was dressed in ceremony. Blood-stained marble steps where music had once echoed. Emma stood close enough to the machinery of power to feel its heat. She heard names whispered before they disappeared. She knew which men would be spared and which would be offered to the crowd as reassurance. She listened as justice was translated into necessity. And through it all, Horatio Nelson's shadow loomed large. He was no longer merely a naval hero. He was an instrument. His victory at the Nile had elevated him beyond question. Britain needed symbols. Naples needed protection. The Queen needed certainty. Nelson provided all three, and Emma stood beside him. The world began to speak their names together, not as lovers, not yet publicly, but as a unit, as influence, as something dangerously effective. Emma understood the danger before anyone else dared name it. Power without accountability always demanded a sacrifice. She did not know yet that she would be one of them. At court, she was indispensable. Queen Maria Carolina trusted her implicitly, too implicitly. Emma translated fear into resolve. She softened panic into strategy. She framed brutality as survival. She never ordered executions, but she helped justify them. That distinction mattered less with every passing day. Emma did not enjoy this role, but she did not step away. She told herself she was preventing worse outcomes. That influence allowed mitigation, that without her presence, cruelty would move unchecked. She had survived long enough to understand how people rationalize their own dissent. Nelson, meanwhile, moved like a man burning from both ends. He was celebrated everywhere he went, applauded, embraced, relied upon, yet the war had carved deep hollows into him. His health faltered, his temper sharpened, his patience thinned. Emma became his refuge, not only emotionally, psychologically. With her, he did not need to perform victory. He could admit fear, doubt, exhaustion. She steadied him, and in doing so, tied her fate irrevocably to his. Their relationship, once whispered, became undeniable. Naples gossiped openly. Diplomats exchanged glances heavy with judgment. The British establishment began to watch more closely. Sir William watched too. Older now, slower, aware that history had begun to move faster than he could manage. He did not intervene, whether from love, resignation, or the quiet knowledge that the world had already shifted beyond his control. He allowed the bond to solidify. That silence would cost him dearly. Emma felt the shift in tone when letters from England arrived, where once admiration flowed freely. Now caution crept in. Praise became conditional, support carefully phrased. She was no longer merely Lady Hamilton. She was a liability. Nelson felt it too. His enemies had found a weakness. Not on the battlefield, in the heart. The British press sharpened its language. Satirists sketched Emma as seductress, corrupter, foreign influence, a woman who had ensnared Britain's greatest hero and bent him away from duty. The irony cut deeply. Emma had never pulled Nelson from duty. She had held him upright when duty threatened to destroy him. But public narrative had no use for nuance. Naples, once her sanctuary, began to close around her. The Queen still depended on her, but dependence breeds resentment. Emma became reminder as much as ally, a witness to decisions the Queen wished forgotten. Power isolates before it abandons. The first real fracture came quietly. A decision Nelson made, harsh, irreversible, echoed back through London with unexpected force. Parliament questioned. Admiralty hesitated. Support wavered. Emma sensed the change before Nelson admitted it. She saw it in the way letters went unanswered, in the delay of funds, in the sudden interest in his private conduct. The same society that had elevated him now prepared to discipline him, and Emma would be the lever. Sir William fell ill. Age and strain caught up with him swiftly. The diplomat who had navigated decades of European tension found his body unwilling to continue. Emma cared for him with devotion. Guilt lived quietly beside gratitude. She knew she had taken something from him, even if he had offered it freely. When Sir William died, the world did not pause. It rarely does. Emma lost more than a husband. She lost insulation. His death stripped away legitimacy, protection, structure. What remained was reputation, and reputation had already turned. Nelson grieved him sincerely, but grief did not slow the machinery gathering around them. Without Sir William, Emma's position collapsed with terrifying speed. Income vanished, status evaporated, invitations ceased. Naples no longer required her. She and Nelson became inconvenient reminders of a chapter others wished closed. They left Italy under a cloud, not in disgrace, not yet, but under scrutiny that would not relent. England awaited them, and England would not forgive, as their ship cut through gray water. Emma stood at the rail once more. The sea that had once promised rebirth now reflected something colder. She had reached the height of power without ever officially holding it. And now she felt the ground beneath her begin to shift. The fall had not yet come, but the cracks were visible, and gravity, once felt only by others, was turning its attention toward her. England did not welcome them home. It tolerated them. There is a difference. And Emma Hamilton felt it the moment her feet touched English ground. Naples had judged her in whispers. England judged her in print. The air itself seemed colder, heavier with propriety and memory. The sea mist carried not promise, but accusation. Horatio Nelson returned as a hero. Emma returned as a question. The nation wanted his victories without his complications, his courage without his choices. They applauded the battles and frowned at the aftermath. They embraced the myth and recoiled from the woman standing beside it. Emma understood this instantly. She had learned long ago that admiration was conditional, that the same gaze which elevated could also dissect. England's gaze was surgical now. It measured her clothes, her posture, her presence. It searched for excess. It searched for fault, and it found it everywhere. Pamphlets circulated. Caricatures sharpened their lines. Satirists drew her larger than life, lips exaggerated, posture suggestive. A foreign stain upon British virtue. She was no longer Lady Hamilton, the cultured hostess of Naples. She was a symbol of indulgence, of influence unchecked, of a hero led astray. Nelson tried to shield her, but shields crack under sustained pressure. He was celebrated publicly and scrutinized privately. Admiralty meetings stretched longer. Letters arrived colder. Praise came with conditions attached. His health suffered under the strain. The old wounds flared. The fatigue deepened. He slept poorly. He drank more than he admitted. Emma watched. She always watched. Their household, once buoyed by status and expectation, began to thin. Invitations dwindled. Doors closed with polite finality. Friends from Naples wrote less frequently. Those who had courted Emma's presence now avoided it. England was narrowing their options. Financial reality arrived without drama. Sir William's estate had been less stable than Emma had believed. Debts surfaced. Income streams dried. Promises made in Naples evaporated under English law. Pensions delayed. Payments questioned. Support reconsidered. Emma read the accounts herself. Numbers did not lie. They simply accused. For the first time since Swan Cottage. She felt the old pressure return, the tightening awareness that survival required calculation. But this time, the stakes were higher. There were servants to dismiss, properties to maintain, reputations to manage. Nelson's income, though substantial in appearance, was unreliable. Honors did not pay bills. Glory did not settle accounts. The state that had elevated him now hesitated to sustain him. Emma began to sell. First discreetly, jewelry removed from velvet cases, paintings quietly offered. Objects that had once symbolized arrival now became assets to be converted. Each sale felt like an amputation. Nelson resisted at first. He had never been adept at domestic reality. War had taught him decisiveness, not restraint. He did not understand the daily erosion of security the way Emma did. He believed recognition would eventually translate into support. Emma knew better. She had lived long enough at the edge to recognize when the ground was giving way. Tension entered their conversations, not loudly, not cruelly, but persistently. Nelson spoke of duty, of future commands, of battles yet to be won. Emma spoke of debts, of creditors, of the cost of waiting. They loved each other fiercely. That did not spare them. Love did not prevent resentment from taking root. Nelson resented the scrutiny that followed him home. Emma resented the vulnerability she felt growing daily. Each believed they were protecting the other. Each felt misunderstood. England amplified every fracture. When Emma became pregnant, the reaction was swift and merciless. No allowance was made for humanity. No forgiveness extended for circumstance. The child was not celebrated as life. It was framed as scandal incarnate. Nelson's enemies found new ammunition. Emma felt the isolation close in. She retreated from society not out of shame, but necessity. Appearances had become traps. Every outing risked another headline, another caricature, another whispered judgment that followed her down the street. Motherhood did not soften the world's gaze. It hardened it. Financial pressure mounted. Creditors grew bolder. Letters more insistent. Legal language crept into conversations once conducted politely. Emma negotiated constantly, extending deadlines, appealing to loyalty, leveraging what little influence remained. She was good at it. Too good. Nelson began to feel displaced in his own life. The man who commanded fleets now deferred to Emma on household matters. He bristled at his dependence even as he relied upon it. Pride and gratitude tangled dangerously. Their arguments grew sharper, not frequent, but decisive. Words spoken that could not be retrieved. Silences that stretched longer than comfort allowed. Emma felt the weight of history pressing in. She had risen through awareness, through adaptation, through connection. Now, those same skills were being tested against a system that refused to accommodate complexity. England wanted absolutes, hero or villain, virtue or corruption. man or woman. Emma did not fit. Nelson's health deteriorated visibly. The strain of command returned him to sea repeatedly, each departure tearing at Emma's stability. Each absence magnified the household's fragility. Each return carried new exhaustion. They began to live between departures, between reprieves, between hope and dread. The press did not relent. Emma became shorthand for excess, for foreign influence, for moral decline. Her past was excavated ruthlessly. Swan Cottage was dragged into the light and twisted into accusation. Poverty reframed as ambition. Survival reframed as manipulation. Emma read everything. She did not cry. She had learned too much to waste energy on despair. Instead, she recalibrated. She understood now that England would not restore her. It would wait for her to fail. And when she did, it would call the failure inevitable. Nelson sensed this too late. His loyalty to Emma hardened into defiance. He refused to distance himself publicly. That refusal cost him quietly. Appointments delayed. Support softened. Admiration cooled. Love became an act of resistance, and resistance carries consequences. As debts tightened and prospects narrowed, Emma stood once more at the threshold between survival and collapse. She had faced it before, but never with so much to lose. England had turned its back. The question now was not whether love would endure, but whether it could survive the weight of everything stacked against it. The fall had not yet completed itself, but it was accelerating. And Emma Hamilton, once the embodiment of soft power, now felt that power slipping through her fingers like sand. Death did not arrive for Horatio Nelson quietly. It came with thunder. Cannons roared across the Atlantic wind. Timber shattered. Smoke swallowed the horizon. At Trafalgar, history demanded its price, and Nelson paid it in full. The bullet did not hesitate. It entered his body with the same decisiveness he had lived by. When word reached England, the nation erupted in mourning so loud it drowned out everything else. Bells rang, churches filled. Poets wrote quickly, urgently, afraid to miss the moment. The myth solidified before the body had cooled. Britain did not lose a man. It gained a legend. Emma Hamilton learned of his death not in a cathedral, not surrounded by ceremony, but in a room already heavy with debt. The letter shook in her hands. She read it once, then again. Then she sat down. Because standing required effort she no longer possessed. The house felt suddenly too large, not because it was grand, because it was empty. Grief did not arrive as tears. It arrived as silence, the kind that settles into corners, that makes footsteps sound foreign, that turns furniture into obstacles rather than comforts. Emma moved through rooms as though they belonged to someone else. Nelson was gone, and with him, the last fragile barrier between her and abandonment. Public mourning did not include her. She was not invited into the nation's grief. She existed outside it, adjacent, inconvenient, unmentionable. While England draped itself in black and gold, Emma was erased from the narrative with surgical precision. Newspapers praised Nelson's virtue. They omitted her name. When they could not, they reframed it. She became footnote, scandal, excess, never love, never partnership, never the woman who had steadied him when victory hollowed him out. The funeral procession was magnificent. Emma did not attend. She watched from behind closed shutters as crowds surged through streets. Voices raised in reverence for a man she had known in exhaustion and doubt. The irony cut deeply. The world adored the version of Nelson that had cost him his peace, and now it demanded that she disappear with him. Financial reality descended without ceremony. Promises evaporated. Pensions delayed. Appeals unanswered. Nelson's will, generous in intention, proved inadequate against legal resistance and institutional reluctance. The state honored its hero. It ignored his companion. Creditors did not ignore her. They arrived with letters first, polite, formal, firm, then with visits, then with demands that could no longer be postponed. Emma negotiated tirelessly, extending deadlines, invoking memory, appealing to gratitude. Gratitude. She learned, had an expiration date. Servants were dismissed quietly. Properties surrendered reluctantly. Objects sold piecemeal, silver first, then paintings, then books whose margins still held notes from better years. Each sale was an erasure. Society retreated completely. Doors closed without explanation. Invitations ceased. Friends from Naples wrote less frequently. Then, not at all. Those who had once depended on Emma's presence now avoided it. As though proximity carried contagion, Emma felt the punishment not as violence, but as absence. No one accused her openly. They simply withdrew. That was the cruelty. The child, Nelson's child, grew under the weight of whispers. Emma shielded her fiercely, aware that innocence offered no protection in a society that required scapegoats. Motherhood did not redeem her in the public eye. It complicated her disgrace. Money vanished faster than Emma could manage it. She borrowed, then borrowed again. Each loan tightened the trap. Interest compounded. Mercy did not. Prison loomed, not as threat, but inevitability. Emma, once mistress of rooms where decisions shaped nations, now measured days by what could be postponed and what could not. Grief finally arrived fully. Not as sobbing, as fatigue, a bone-deep weariness that made mornings heavier than nights. Nelson's absence pressed into everything. She heard his voice in memory, felt his hand where it no longer rested. She spoke to him sometimes, not in madness, in habit. He had been the one person who saw her entirely, not as ornament, not as threat, not as instrument. Without him, the world reverted to cruelty it had merely paused. England completed its quiet sentence. When Emma was arrested for debt, there was no outrage, no scandal, only administrative efficiency. Prison was not dramatic. It was small, claustrophobic, humiliating in its ordinariness. Emma endured it the way she had endured everything else, with observation, restraint, dignity stripped to its barest form. But dignity does not pay debts. When release came, it brought no restoration, only exile. Emma fled England not in disgrace, but in exhaustion. She crossed the Channel with little more than what she could carry. Calais received her without judgment, because it had no expectations left to violate. There, in a rented room overlooking the harbor, she lived quietly, too quietly. The sea sounded different now, not like promise, like indifference. Her body weakened. Illness crept in without drama. She did not fight it. Resistance required belief in recovery. And Emma had learned not to bargain with reality. She thought often of Swan Cottage, of her mother's hands, of doors creaking in the wind. The circle felt complete. On her last days, Emma Hamilton was no longer scandal. She was not symbol. She was simply a woman whose life had intersected history too closely to escape unscathed. She died without ceremony. The world did not pause, but something lingered. The uncomfortable truth that power does not forgive women who wield it, that love, when it crosses class, country, and expectation, is punished long after it ends. Nelson was immortalized in stone. Emma faded into memory. And yet, history does not forget so easily. It waits for voices willing to tell the whole story. Death did not come for Emma Hamilton as punishment. It came as silence in Calais. The sea moved without concern for names. Tides arrived, tides withdrew, ships entered harbor and left again, carrying lives that would continue without pause. Emma watched from a narrow window, wrapped in blankets that never seemed warm enough. She had become very still, not because she wished to die, but because there was nothing left to resist. Her body failed gradually. Without spectacle, illness hollowed her quietly, as poverty once had. The same dull ache returned, the familiar tightening of breath, the heaviness in the limbs, the sense that effort no longer yielded reward. She did not complain. Complaints require belief in remedy. Emma Hamilton had outlived belief. Her final room was small, plain, rented. The walls bore no art. The furnishings had no memory. Nothing in it testified to who she had been, only to what she had lost. And yet, in that bareness, something honest remained. She thought often of the sea, of Naples, glowing under Mediterranean light, of London, choking beneath smoke, of Swan Cottage, damp and fragile at the edge of fields. Her life unfolded backward in fragments, not regrets, recognitions. She remembered her mother's hands, cracked, capable, enduring, the quiet dignity of a woman who survived without ever being praised for it. She understood her now more than ever. She remembered Greville, his precision, his cold patience, the way he had shaped her without ever loving her. She did not hate him. Hatred requires energy. She had spent hers elsewhere. She remembered Sir William, his gentleness, his curiosity, the respect he had offered when the world offered none. She wished she had been able to protect him from the storm she carried with her. And she remembered Nelson, always Nelson, not the hero carved into stone, not the name thundered by crowds, but the man who stood at windows late at night, staring out at water he could not conquer. The man who admitted fear only once and trusted her with it. She spoke to him sometimes, not aloud, in the way one remembers breathing. Emma Hamilton did not die thinking herself wronged. She died understanding the cost. History does not punish women for failing. It punishes them for succeeding too visibly. She had risen without permission, crossed boundaries without apology, occupied rooms not meant for her. She had wielded influence without title, softened power without armor, and for that, she had been erased. Nelson received monuments. She received silence. That was the verdict. When she died, there was no ceremony, no procession, no marble, only a modest burial far from the centers of power she had once shaped. England did not mark the day. Naples did not mourn. The world moved on. But history is not finished with her. It rarely is. Because stories like Emma Hamilton's do not disappear. They sink. They wait. They resurface when societies begin to question their own myths. She was not a seductress. She was not a villain. She was not merely a muse. She was a woman who learned to read power before she learned to read books. A woman who understood that beauty, when paired with intelligence, frightened systems built on exclusion. Her life was not a cautionary tale. It was an indictment of a world that celebrates men for conquest and condemns women for influence, of nations that exploit loyalty and discard complexity, of histories written loudly and truths whispered only later. Emma Hamilton lived between worlds and paid the price for it. The sea outside Calais continues to move. Tides still come and go, and somewhere, beneath the noise of monuments and myths, her story endures, cold, unresolved, impossible to forget, not as scandal, but as evidence.